You will not remember what I show you now, and yet I shall awaken memories of love and crime and death.
Okay, just in case if you haven't heard already, Universal Studios is trying to create their own cinematic universe, just like Marvel and DC. Of course, Universal doesn't have a line of superheroes to work with, but they do have a long line of horror monsters, and that's exactly what they want to do. They want to create a line of movies starring the horror monsters and eventually having them star in their own films. This is known as the Dark Universe. Being a horror fan, I would love this more than all the superhero films, because I'm so burned out on all of those. But at the same time, I don't know how Universal is going to pull this off. It seems like a stretch and a very tall order to complete. If it works, I'm all good with that. If it doesn't, then I will be very sad. In case you didn't realize, the 2017 remake of The Mummy is the first in line for the Dark Universe, eventually moving on to The Bride of Frankenstein, The Creature of the Black Lagoon, The Invisible Man, Van Helsing, The Wolfman, Frankenstein, Dracula, Phantom of the Opera, and finally The Hunchback of Notre Dame. These are all the ones we know of at least. But I see a huge problem here. The reason why Marvel has made it work is because they are able to pump out these films like clockwork. So they are able to create and connect all these films in a modest short amount of time. Universal, on the other hand, may not have this luxury. Now, since The Mummy is the first for the Dark Universe, and it is 2017, that's fine. But then the next is Bride of Frankenstein, and it's set to be released in 2019. Like, seriously? That's still far off. Who knows when The Creature of the Black Lagoon will be ready? It could be out in 2022. By the time they get to The Hunchback of Notre Dame, it could be in the 2030s. They are going to have to release these movies like clockwork as well, and have them all be financially successful to be able to pull this off. I would love for this to happen, but it's going to be a hard climb up the mountain to achieve this. So, as I mentioned, for these films to work, they have to be successful and make money. So all these movies' lives are riding on the first in the series, the 2017 remake of the Universal horror monster classic, The Mummy. So let's take a look at this film and see if it will raise the Universal monsters to the top, or will it just get a stake to the heart and kill any chance for all this to happen. This Mummy film is in no way connected to the original 1932 or 1999 remake. While the 1999 film starring Brendan Fraser was a loose remake of the original, this one here is technically a reboot, taking the Mummy concept down a whole new path. Does it succeed? Well, let's see.
Okay. Alright.
Kick her off!
I think one of the biggest problems for the film is the story. Not necessarily because it's flat out terrible, but rather because the way it's told and the way each scene feels glued together. Without giving too much away, I will try to give you a brief summary of what the film is about. In ancient Egypt, there was a princess named Ahmenet, and she was first in line to become the queen of Egypt, at least until her father's second wife had a son. Angered by this, she sells her soul to the god Set. In return, he gives her a special dagger that can transfer him into a body. The princess then kills her entire family and is about to transfer the god Set into her lover's body until her father's priests stop her and kill her lover. And then they mummify her and they bury her far, far from Egypt. Later, in present day, she is uncovered by our protagonist and friends, and somehow she is resurrected. She obviously plans to use the dagger on our protagonist to bring the god Set into our world. Our protagonist then learns of a secret organization named the Prodigium, who specializes in capturing and studying dark monsters. And the rest is, well, between the Mummy and our hero. All in all, it's not too bad, but it's just the way it's told is the problem. Seriously, the whole film just feels like they filmed in certain locations and came up with these huge spectacle scenes and pieced them all together, almost like forcing a puzzle piece where it doesn't belong. There's no real cohesiveness from scene to scene, which is a shame because I feel they could have done much better with the plot. But maybe it's not just the story's fault, maybe it's the characters.
What are you thinking? I'm thinking we're probably gonna die here. I knew it!
So, in this film, there are really only 4 characters that matter. Maybe 5. I have a problem with most of them. So first, we have our main protagonist, Nick Morton, played by Tom Cruise, of course. The character is a former US military officer who has become a soldier of fortune. He really only cares about treasure. He accidentally discovers the tomb of Princess Ahmenet, and by releasing her, she curses him by infusing him with the god Set. He quickly becomes haunted by her and has to try to fight with the god Set in his mind and fight the mummy. For the most part, he's not a very memorable protagonist. Sadly, I feel it's because of Tom Cruise. Not saying Tom is a bad actor, but rather he doesn't seem to actually try to play characters anymore. If you look at most of his recent films, he just plays himself. Mission Impossible, Jack Reacher, and now this, he's just playing Tom. So I don't see a former US military officer, I just see Tom. He's not bad, and his action scenes are always great, but it's just jarring to see Tom versus the mummy, and not see Nick versus the mummy. Then, of course, we have our forced love interest that every movie has to have now, Jennifer Housey. She is an archaeologist who has a little bit of a past with Nick, and you eventually learn she isn't exactly what she claims to be. Jennifer is played by Annabelle Wallis. This is actually the first time I've watched anything she's ever been in. Again, while her acting is not all that bad or anything, she's just not memorable and just comes off as a damsel in distress. Not saying that it's automatically bad, because I do get tired of seeing every girl in films now being a martial arts master, but her role doesn't seem to be all that important to the film. I feel the film could have gone on much better without her character. You could have just fused her together with Tom Cruise and made him an archaeologist instead of a former soldier. That way he could have been a little bit more closer to Indiana Jones, which most likely would have worked better with this plot. Next, we have our main antagonist, Princess Ahmenet, played by Sofia Boutella, I think that's how you pronounce her name, who I enjoyed in Star Trek Beyond, and I really enjoyed her here. I personally feel she did fine with the role she was given. She looks pretty badass, and she's pretty fucking hot. And at times when the film tries to be horror, she definitely does her best to pull it off. As the mummy, she clearly isn't as memorable as Boris Karloff, which I'm sure no one expected her to be. But as a pure villain, she was okay. I don't have a problem with her. Okay, then there's Nick's friend, Chris Vale, played by Jake Johnson, who I never heard of until Jurassic World. He honestly doesn't really matter in this film at all. He's only there to add humor and exposition. Personally, he seems to be inspired by the character Jack Goodman from An American Werewolf in London. If you've seen that movie, you would know why when you see this film. I personally didn't find any of his attempts at humor to be funny at all here. It all just fell flat for me. And again, his character isn't all that important to the film either. His character really didn't have to be here at all.
I knew it!
And at last but not least, we have the best character in this film, Dr. Henry Jekyll, also known as Mr. Hyde, played by Russell Crowe. This is the biggest surprise of the film, because I wasn't expecting Dr. Jekyll, but luckily, it's a great surprise. Here we get our first taste of the film's crossing over. In the film, Dr. Jekyll is a scientist who leads a secret organization called the Prodigium, whose sole purpose is to locating, containing, and when necessary, destroying evil. Obviously, we know the story of Dr. Jekyll, but if you don't, I'll explain it. Thanks to a failed experiment that was supposed to purge himself of all evil impulses, he must regularly inject himself with a serum to prevent transforming into his evil alter ego, Edward Hyde, or simply known as Mr. Hyde. The best thing about this movie is Russell Crowe's performance. He's great as Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. He does an amazing job capturing what that character is all about, at least in my opinion. But honestly, he isn't really needed in this film either. He is only there to connect this so-called dark universe together. Think of him as the Nick Fury of the world. I enjoyed his performance and would love to see him return to the character in his own standalone film, which for some reason isn't being planned. Dr. Jekyll deserves his own film, especially if Russell Crowe is playing him. Does that make any sense to have this character and not give him a film? He is a classic monster.
You saw that, right?
One aspect that this film nails down is the special effects. They're great looking. Sure, a lot of these over-the-top scenes didn't have to be included in my opinion, but since they are there, at least they are done well. Personally, every setting the film shows looks great with no noticeable problems. There's a good amount of detail in the monsters and the world. Since this film is being marketed as a summer blockbuster film, the action scenes are appropriate and well shot. Seriously, if you're just watching a movie to have a fun time, these scenes should suffice the average moviegoer fan. At first, when I saw the trailer, I wasn't really feeling the mummy's look, but she was able to win me over during this film. She looks great and does a great job conveying she is a major threat, but still could have been improved upon. Now let's get to the major downfall of this film, and also with what is being planned with all the other films. It seems to be centered on copying Marvel, which means humor and action with over-the-top scenes. In case you didn't realize, the Universal monsters are part of the horror genre, but sadly, there wasn't any real horror in this film. Maybe a scene or two where they tried to show some sort of horror, but it just falls flat on its fucking face. Horror seems to be neglected throughout the film, so it could focus on fight scenes and explosions, which works in a Marvel comic book movie, but not so much here. Not saying there can't be any of that, because the 1999 remake did the same thing, but when they attempted to add some horror elements, it worked much better. It was an action-adventure horror film. This remake is clearly an action-adventure film. The Mummy needs horror. Not just The Mummy, but all these films need horror. I think it's a harder sale to make a connecting universe that is just horror, but it doesn't mean you have to completely remove it and ignore your own roots. This is one section that I place high value in for these films, because they are classic horror monsters. Removing the horror, or just placing a weak attempt at horror, is unacceptable in a film like this. So, with all that, how is the 2017 remake of The Mummy? Sadly, I must say it's very painfully average. There's a few good ideas, and some of it works, but most of it just feels unloved and generic. I can see The Mummy, but there is no soul in this film. It's a hollow shell of what it should be. It's been mummified. The film tries to be something it's not, and by doing so, you really killed any chance for it being a good film. Now, don't get me wrong, I don't think it's as bad as some people are saying. Sure, it's nowhere near as good as the original or the 1999 remake, but I do believe there is some enjoyable fun to be had with this film. If you don't care too much about the past films or never even heard of those, then you might actually like this film and enjoy it for what it is. But if you have seen those past films and love the classic Universal monsters, you will most likely be disappointed. There's not enough of what made the original films great here, which is good story, serious acting, great characters, and beautiful, dark, creepy sets. The 2017 Mummy should have been much better, but in the long term, I feel it's completely forgettable. I do insist you still watch it and make up your own mind, because who knows, you may actually like it or even fall in love with it. I kind of doubt that, but who knows. But I would say, just don't go in expecting too much. I give The Mummy 3 skulls out of 5. It's not the best movie ever, but it's not the worst I've seen. There is some fun to be had here, but it could and should have been much better. So with all these Dark Universe films being planned, this isn't a good start. Hopefully the next film is much better, and remembers its roots, horror, you can't make films about the Universal monsters and not add any horror. Plus, please give Russell Crowe his own standalone Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde film. But sadly, I don't actually see him coming back to the role because of how this movie is performing, which that's already going to be a blow to making these movies all connect, because now you're already going to lose your best character, and I honestly don't see Tom Cruise coming back to play the same role again either. So in the long term, it's not a good start for the Dark Universe film. This is very bad. I wish the movie would have been a lot better, so it would have done a lot better. But you know, sometimes these have rocky starts, and hopefully they can pull themselves back together and make the next film better and start getting on track. If you enjoyed this video, please like and share, and comment if you have anything to say. I would love to hear people's opinions on this film and the Dark Universe in general. I'm going to try to start getting back into the horror movie reviews, and if there are any horror films you want to hear my opinion on, please let me know. I would be very happy to review it. Until next time, I'll see you guys later.
It was not only this body that I loved, it was thy soul. I destroy this lifeless thing. Thou shalt take its place but for a few moments, and then rise again even as I have risen.